Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Sign the separation agreement by the end of the day, Dr. Vance." The words, sharp as a scalpel, cut through the sterile silence of Director Thorne's office. Outside, the midday sun beat down on the imposing, glass facade of St. Jude's Medical Center. Dr. Elias Vance, 41, a black single father, stood numbly. His 8-year-old daughter, Lena, waited quietly in the hallway, clutching her worn backpack, her tight curls a halo in the harsh fluorescent glow. Director Thorne, the administrative director, slid a termination notice across the polished counter with a gaze as cold and impersonal as the steel instruments Elias once wielded. "Your contract ends today, Dr. Vance." Elias simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the dismissal. He gathered his badge and the few personal items from his desk. Lena took her father's warm, brown hand, their fingers intertwining, and they walked out into the unforgiving light. Elias took slow, deliberate steps down the sidewalk. In the distance, the faint, distinct thump of heavy helicopter blades began to vibrate, a low, ominous hum. Dr. Elias Vance, at 41, was a study in quiet intensity. The lines etched around his deep brown eyes were carved, not by age, but by years spent making split-second decisions where life hung by a thread, where every breath was a battle. As a black single father, his existence now revolved around the predictable, yet profound, rhythm of raising Lena, his anchor. His current role was an emergency room physician, working on a short-term contract, a necessary compromise, a stepping stone. Years ago, Elias had been a decorated frontline combat physician, a hero in the unforgiving crucible of war. He didn't just treat battlefield injuries, he redefined emergency trauma surgery under fire, earning accolades he rarely, if ever, spoke of. That chapter of his life closed abruptly after a devastating mass casualty incident. A day etched in his soul. The sheer volume of loss, the chaos he could not control, extinguished the fierce, competitive drive that once defined his career. He left the military not in defeat, but in search of an environment less steeped in the constant threat of loss, a place where he could simply be a father first, a protector, a builder of futures, not just a repairer of broken bodies. This civilian job was meant to be his anchor, a stable environment where Lena could wait for him, accustomed to the sight of her dad in scrubs, ready with her backpack and a patient smile. This routine was his new battlefield, a relentless, yet stabilizing rhythm. Elias was a disciplined, reserved man. His focus was always on the patient, never the politics. He viewed his medical skill as a solemn covenant, a promise to prioritize human life above all else. As a black man who had fought to be taken seriously, in more than one uniform, that covenant meant everything. This unwavering focus, however, brought him into direct and repeated conflict with Director Thorne. Thorne, the new administrative director, was a creature of efficiency, prioritizing ruthless cost-cutting protocols over human factors. She saw medicine as a flowchart, the hospital as a business unit. Elias saw it as a desperate, sacred fight for survival. The friction had been constant, a low-burning fire. Elias had repeatedly and vocally opposed her attempts to cut corners on equipment maintenance and nurse-to-patient ratios, arguing that such reductions inevitably compromised patient safety and violated his professional oath, a betrayal of trust. In too many meetings, he'd felt the familiar tension of being the only black man at the table, knowing that his firm tone, his passionate advocacy, could be misread as aggression while he was simply trying to keep people alive. The core of the recent conflict centered on the replacement of St. Jude's only ECMO machine, a device vital for life support during severe heart and lung failure. Elias argued it was end-of-life and dangerously unreliable. Thorne dismissed the $1.2 million expense as non-essential capital expenditure. For Elias, relying on that machine was a gamble he couldn't take with a patient's life. It was a betrayal of his oath, a moral compromise too great to bear. The final, heated debate had occurred that very morning over the replacement of this critical, expensive piece of monitoring equipment. Elias's argument, based on empirical evidence and his unparalleled experience, was dismissed as insubordination. For Thorne, His ethics were an expensive inconvenience that jeopardized the bottom line. The contract termination was swift and absolute, an exercise of pure administrative power, meant to send a clear message to the remaining staff: conform or be cast out. Walking out, Lena looked up at him, her small brow furrowed with confusion, sensing the profound heaviness of the moment. "Daddy," she whispered, her hand tightening in his, "did you save someone wrong?" Elias stopped, knelt down on the cold, sterile hospital sidewalk, and looked his daughter directly in the eye. His deep brown gaze was steady, unwavering. His military training kept his tone level, reassuring. "A rock in the storm." "No, sweetie," he answered, his voice firm and steady, without a trace of regret. "I chose safety. I refuse to let them put profit over people. That's always the right choice, Lena. Always." He rose, picking up the small box containing the last vestiges of his professional life, his stethoscope, a worn photograph of Lena. In the picture, a beautiful black family, just the two of them, smiled at the camera, her tight curls wild in the summer light, his arm wrapped protectively around her. He carried the weight of his dismissal, a quiet, discarded professional, but he carried his integrity, which was worth far more than any job title. His only immediate concern was the calculation, already running in his head, scrambling for rent, health insurance, school fees. His path was now uncertain, but his principle remained uncompromised. He felt a cold, familiar knot in his stomach, the same dread he'd felt years ago, realizing that the system, civilian or military, sometimes prioritizes logistics over the human cost. But this time, he wouldn't just walk away. This time, he would fight. He squared his broad shoulders, a silent vow etched into his very being. Zola would never pay the price for his unyielding moral stand. Father and daughter began the long walk home, a path usually swallowed by the hum of a car after Elias's late shifts. Today, every step was a heavy, deliberate measure of their new reality: unemployment. Elias's mind, once a rapid-fire triage unit, now ran complex financial models: rent, car payment, Zola's school trip, health insurance. The numbers were a suffocating weight. They swam against the vibrant backdrop of the city street, each calculation adding a fresh, searing layer of stress to the silent indignity of his dismissal. Zola, sensing the storm raging within her father, deliberately tried to step on his shadow, a small, innocent game. It was an endearing gesture of closeness, a tiny anchor that momentarily pulled him from the spiraling abyss of his thoughts. Elias focused on her presence, her warmth, the secure grip of her tiny hand in his, rather than the cold, administrative betrayal he had just endured. They paused at a corner store, a brief respite, as Elias bought 2 bottles of water. A sudden, piercing siren ripped through the ambient city noise. This wasn't a standard ambulance wail. It was a series of quick, high-pitched alerts, a frantic rhythm signifying an extreme, high-priority emergency transport. Elias's head snapped up instinctively. His years of military training made him instantly recognize the urgent cadence, a rare, complex emergency signal meant for specialized units, moving with desperate speed. His eyes scanned the direction of the sound, his body tensing in an involuntary, practiced response. He could almost visualize the scenario, the type of injury, the personnel involved, the critical next steps. But then, just as quickly, he forced himself to relax. He reminded himself he was no longer part of that system. His hospital ID was confiscated, his expertise unwanted. He was just a black man walking home with his daughter, unemployed and discarded. The thought was bitter, a harsh metallic taste in his mouth. He continued walking, but the tension lingered, a rigid knot in his shoulders. The siren was a brutal echo of the past, specifically the disastrous night in Kandahar. He remembered the overwhelming number of casualties, the frantic scramble for working equipment, and the terrible realization that a faulty generator had caused critical delays in a field hospital. That mechanical failure, a purely logistical oversight, had contributed to the deaths of 2 young soldiers he had promised to protect. The memory was sharp, the smell of ozone, the screams, the sticky sensation of blood he couldn't wash off. Never again, he had sworn. That memory fueled his current fight against a system that valued profit over human life. He had resigned himself to a quieter existence, determined that he would only save lives under conditions of absolute professional integrity. Zola, who had observed the entire silent drama, her eyes wide with concern, piped up quietly, "But Dad, what if they really need you?" Elias squeezed the plastic bottle tightly, unable to meet her gaze. "If they need you." That phrase was the very core of his identity, the principle he had fought for just hours before. He felt the pull, the irresistible, professional gravity of an unmet crisis, a feeling of responsibility that transcended his personal situation. But he was an outside observer now. He walked on, trying to deafen himself to the distant, fading siren. The air, already thick with midday heat, began to shift. A strong, unexpected gust of wind whipped Zola's tight curls across her face, carrying with it a strange, acrid scent of jet fuel and dry grass. Elias pulled her closer, scanning the sky. The low, rhythmic thumping sound that was steadily growing louder, not receding like the ambulance, replaced the silence in his head. It was a powerful, distinctive sound that cut through the city's noise, a sound that immediately triggered Elias's long-dormant military instincts. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump quickly grew from a distant murmur to a resonant, physical vibration. This wasn't a civilian craft. The weight and speed were immense, the frequency of the blades indicating immense power and urgency. Elias looked up at the sky, shielding his eyes from the fierce afternoon sun. Two dark shapes, moving with aggressive speed and precision, appeared over the skyline. They were military medical evacuation helicopters, identifiable by their specialized markings and their low, fast trajectory. The sound escalated into a deafening roar. Shaking the windows of the storefronts, they passed and forcing pedestrians to stop and shield their ears. The noise was overwhelming, a sudden, violent interruption of the city's routine. The two massive aircraft were not heading toward the hospital. They were aiming directly for the public park just 2 blocks ahead, the only clear landing zone nearby. Elias stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes, once full of weary resignation, now sharp, focused, and instantly calculating the situation. His heart pounded with the sudden, undeniable recognition that the crisis was no longer distant or abstract. The crisis was coming to him. He was no longer walking home. He was standing in the path of a massive, unfolding emergency. If you want to see how Elias, the discarded hero, answers the call, subscribe and join us for the next chapter. The twin medical helicopters descended rapidly, kicking up a massive vortex of dust, leaves, and debris as they slammed down onto the grass of the small public park, the only clear space in the area. The noise was deafening, forcing Elias and Zola to cover their ears. The landing was executed with aggressive speed, signifying the gravity of the situation. Within seconds, a rear ramp dropped from the lead helicopter. A young, crisply uniformed officer, his face etched with controlled urgency, burst from the advanced rescue chopper, scanning the stunned crowd. He bypassed the standard emergency crews, still arriving from the Metropolitan Medical Center, and ignored the bewildered city police officers. He looked directly at the throng, cupping his hands around his mouth, his voice a raw, desperate plea, strained against the immense roar of the twin engines. "Where's the doctor? We need drive. Vance." The shout, amplified by the chaotic soundscape, reverberated through the public plaza, echoing the desperate, immediate nature of the call. Dr. Elias Vance froze, his entire body locking up. Dr. Vance, the name, discarded and irrelevant just an hour ago, was now being called out with desperate military authority, pulling him back into the reality he thought he had left behind forever. Suddenly, the Metropolitan Medical Center administrators appeared, running from the direction of the emergency entrance, having finally grasped the extent of the crisis. Leading the pack, breathless and disheveled, was Director Evelyn Thornton. She saw the two massive tactical transport aircraft, the frantic soldier, and the overwhelming scale of the intervention. Her eyes landed on Elias, standing quietly on the sidewalk, a small box under his arm. She took a hesitant step toward the officer. Confusion etched on her face, but she was too late. Evelyn's mind was a frantic scramble of rationalization. Vance, why him? He's a short-term contractor. The sight of the military officer calling his name negated every spreadsheet and cost-cutting measure she had ever championed. The officer was already heading directly towards Elias. Nia, sensing the enormous, sudden shift in the atmosphere, instinctively tightened her grip on her father's hand. Her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound, dawning pride. Elias took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying his nerves. This was familiar territory. The chaos, the noise, the immediate need for a calm, commanding presence. He gently squeezed Nia's hand and began to walk forward, shedding the mantle of the unemployed civilian with every purposeful step, stepping back into the role of the combat surgeon the nation called. When everything else went catastrophically wrong, the officer, recognizing the doctor's characteristic measured gait, the unmistakable walk of a man who takes charge, met him halfway. He snapped a sharp salute, his respect instantaneous. "Dr. Vance, sir, we have a highly complex, critical trauma patient. Offshore incident, deep decompression and shrapnel trauma. He's stabilized by the field team. But we've run out of surgical time. We need specialist intervention now." He spoke quickly, in the precise shorthand of military trauma, revealing the terrifying nature of the emergency. The patient is a deep-sea salvage engineer. A pressurized equipment failure caused extreme blast force combined with deep water immersion. He's suffering from concurrent decompression sickness, internal shrapnel hemorrhage, and severe hypothermia. The conditions require immediate surgery that simultaneously addresses the blast trauma and manages the rapid pressure fluctuations. During transport, he paused, his eyes fixed on Elias. "Sir, your profile is unique. You are the only surgeon in the National Registry who has executed complex trauma procedures under active, high-pressure, mobile conditions in a non-sterile environment. We couldn't get clearance for a civilian OR in time. And your experience with similar deep decompression, cold environment battlefield wounds is unmatched. The clock has stopped. You're the only one." The implication was chillingly clear. Only Elias possessed a rare combination of surgical skill and tactical, real-world knowledge to handle this specific, life-threatening scenario in a non-sterile, moving environment. The Metropolitan Medical Center's best surgeons were experts in comfortable, zero-movement operating rooms. This man needed a doctor who could operate mid-air. Director Evelyn Thorne, having finally caught up, stood paralyzed a few yards away, her hands clutching her clipboard. Her face was a mask of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror. She finally realized the sheer, unquantifiable value of the doctor she had just dismissed for budget reasons. The man she labeled insubordinate was now the singular focus of a high priority, life-or-death military operation. Elias didn't hesitate. He didn't ask about liability, pay, or protocol. His doctor's oath, dormant for an hour, flared back to life, consuming all other thought. The need was absolute, transcending personal grievances and financial concerns. He only glanced back at Nia, his decision final and unwavering. He knelt, kissing her forehead. "Stay right here, sweetie, don't move. I'll be back in an hour. Be brave for Dad." He gently detached her hand from his. Nia, seeing the professional focus in her father's eyes, the return of the warrior she knew, nodded solemnly, trusting him completely. Elias stood up, dropped the small box containing his belongings, and handed his purchased water bottle to Nia. He then looked at the officer. "Let's go. What's the latest Glasgow? Get me a rundown on his oxygen saturation and core temperature. Those are the variables we fight now." Without another word, he moved toward the medical helicopter, his gait now quick, purposeful, and entirely professional. As he climbed aboard, the massive engines roared to full power, and the rotors began to bite into the air, whipping a huge, blinding cloud of dust and debris over the public plaza and the stunned administrative director. Evelyn instinctively raised her arm to shield her face, standing utterly alone amidst the chaos she had inadvertently caused. The twin-engine helicopter tore through the sky quickly, leaving the city behind and banking sharply toward the vast, glittering expanse of the ocean. Deep within the cramped, vibrating cabin, Dr. Elias Vance was instantly back in his element. The roar, the adrenaline, the impossible constraints. This was his true operating room. He was a maestro of chaos, perfectly adapted to the instability. The patient, strapped to a stretcher, was critical. The injury, exactly as described, complex trauma requiring immediate, precise field surgery to prevent massive systemic failure. Elias took command, his voice a steady, calm anchor against the mechanical din and the crushing pressure of life and death. Prep the field. Ivory access, secure. We are going in now. His instructions were succinct, militarily precise, leaving no room for question. The small, highly trained med team obeyed without hesitation, recognizing the immediate, non-negotiable authority of his skill. Elias quickly assessed the situation, recognizing the unique, escalating danger. The internal bleeding was accelerating, masked by the hypothermia. The decompression sickness meant he couldn't afford rapid changes in altitude. He had to operate immediately, while the pilot maintained a precise, low-altitude flight path. He worked with impossible speed and accuracy, his dark hands moving with the surgical precision of an engineer designing a watch. He utilized every centimeter of the tight space, every flicker of available light, performing a complex procedure that should have required a fully equipped surgical theater. The procedure itself was a masterpiece of improvisation under duress. He used a combination of specialized clamps and a rapid deployment suture technique, honed during his most desperate combat deployments, to seal the deepest vascular wounds. The relentless vibration of the helicopter was a constant, destabilizing enemy, forcing him to anticipate movements, timing his cuts and sutures between the engine's rhythmic pulses. The med team watched in awe. This wasn't surgery, it was surgical combat. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. His focus was absolute, his rhythm unbroken. The clock in his head was the only timekeeper. After a breathless, tense period, Elias finished, securing the area with a temporary but life-saving fix that defied the constraints of the environment. Vital signs stabilizing. We've bought him the time he needed. Get us back to the nearest Level 1 trauma center, fast. The lead flight medic, a seasoned veteran, leaned in, his voice thick with admiration. Doctor, I've seen a lot of things. That was textbook, zero-fault execution. You just did a thoracotomy and massive blood replacement. At 150 knots, Elias merely nodded, his focus already shifting to post-op care. His job was only half done. A radio transmission crackled with the good news, confirming the patient was stable enough for transport. Meanwhile, down in the community square, Evelyn Reed stood rooted to the spot, the dust slowly settling around her. She was having a visceral, internal reckoning. This isn't just about money or budgets. A cold voice whispered in her mind. It's about capability. I prioritized quarterly reports over a man who can save a life mid-flight. The shock was giving way to a sickening wave of professional self-doubt. The raw, desperate sound of the military officer's shout, "We need Dr. Vance," was now the unshakable soundtrack to her administrative failure. She realized she hadn't just fired an employee. She had temporarily disabled a critical national-level asset, a black combat surgeon whose skill reached far beyond her spreadsheets, all for the sake of a $1.2 million expense that now seemed paltry and meaningless compared to the life currently hanging in the balance. Over the ocean, she was the system he was fighting, and the system had lost. Her clipboard slipped from her numb fingers, the papers scattering like useless confetti on the dirty grass. What if he fails? What if the patient dies? Because I created the conditions of his despair, the weight of potential blame, a burden far heavier than any budget deficit, crushed her corporate facade. She looked at Amara, still sitting quietly, radiating a quiet, absolute faith in her father, and felt a burning, humiliating shame. Back in the air, the pilot's voice cut through the intercom. We're clearing the coast, preparing for descent. To the trauma center now. Good work, doctor. Elias wiped the sweat and blood from his brow, his hands shaking slightly, not from fatigue, but from the adrenaline finally receding. The patient's pulse was strong, the saturation numbers climbing steadily. He looked out the small porthole, seeing the city skyline. The hospital, the very place that had rejected him, now appearing in the distance. He had saved a life in the most hostile environment possible, reaffirming his oath. Not to the hospital, but to himself. He was the one they called when the systems failed. A thought struck him, clear and sharp. They tried to take my job, but they can't take my skill. They tried to take my worth, but they can't take my principle. He had been discarded, but necessity had proven his value to the world. An hour later, the distinct, welcome sound of the returning choppers grew loud again. As the first helicopter touched down, the ramp dropped immediately. Dr. Elias Vance, his scrubs stained with blood and sweat, emerged. He looked utterly exhausted but whole, the triumphant look of a doctor who had just won the hardest fight. Amara, who had been sitting patiently on her backpack, jumped up, ignoring the remaining security line. She ran straight to her father. Elias immediately dropped to one knee, embracing her tightly. Burying his face in her curls, it was a moment of pure, silent victory. The doctor was safe. The father was home. The crowd, the nurses, the world watched. The hospital staff, a sea of faces, watched. A tentative ripple of applause began, then surged. A thunderous wave of undeniable respect. No longer did they see a man dismissed, but a titan, their doctor etched with the glorious, life-saving evidence of his unwavering skill. A decorated military officer, a beacon of authority, stepped forward. His gaze swept over the assembled multitude, every administrator, every nurse, every soul from Metropolitan Medical Center. He bypassed Director Evelyn Thorne entirely, his focus laser-sharp on the man who had defied the odds. Dr. Vance, the officer's voice boomed, cutting through the silence. Your professionalism, your courage, you saved a life today that no one else could have touched. On behalf of the armed forces and every life you protect, we thank you for your unparalleled service, for your irreplaceable skill. It was a public, undeniable vindication, not just of a doctor, but of a man's inherent worth. The applause, this time, was a deafening roar, the true sound of a community reclaiming its hero. Dr. Elias Vance stood tall. Lena clutched to his side, accepting the torrent of praise with a quiet, profound dignity. Then his gaze shifted to Director Evelyn Thorne. Tears streamed down her face, her rigid corporate facade crumbling. She stumbled forward, a broken figure. Dr. Vance, Elias. She stammered, using his first name before the entire staff, a public confession. The ECMO machine. It's being replaced immediately, effective this afternoon. I was wrong, fundamentally, disastrously wrong. I apologize for my judgment, for the damage I caused. You are indispensable to this facility. It wasn't just an apology for a firing. It was a public reckoning, an admission of a flawed philosophy, of a system that had dared to treat a black surgeon of his caliber as a disposable line item, a cost to be cut. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Reese Khan, a man of integrity, stepped forward, swiftly navigating the crisis with an immediate offer. Dr. Vance, we are offering you a permanent, long-term contract, effective immediately, full executive compensation, and a dedicated budget for your department. More than that, we are creating a new position, Director of Clinical Safety and Standardization. You will report only to me, and you will have final veto power on all resource allocation pertaining to patient risk. The offer was lavish, immediate, and a testament to his undeniable power. But Dr. Vance was not swayed by the glittering promise of money or prestige. His focus, then as always, was the patients. My terms are simple, he stated, his voice clear, firm, and resonating with unshakable conviction, addressing the entire administrative team, ensuring every single employee present bore witness. The safety protocols I requested this morning, the updated equipment budget, the appropriate staffing ratios, they must be implemented without delay and guaranteed in writing. We will not compromise patient safety for the bottom line, not ever again. Furthermore, the incident review must unequivocally document that the failure to purchase the ECMO machine was a direct administrative error that placed patients at grave risk. This is not about saving my job. This is about holding the system accountable. Chief Medical Officer Khan nodded, humbled, his agreement absolute. Doctor, completely. You set the standard. We need that accountability. Lena squeezed her father's hand, her face alight with a smile of pure, unadulterated pride. The family's dignity had been restored, not by a title, but by the unwavering power of principle. Dr. Vance took Lena's hand, retrieved the small, forgotten box, and together, they walked out of the park, leaving behind a stunned administration scrambling, already implementing his demands. As they continued their walk home, to search and rescue helicopters roared overhead, their thunderous beat, once a symbol of rejection, now echoed as a powerful salute to the man walking. From a crisis, not towards one. It wasn't the job title that defined Dr. Vance. It was this moment. Someone desperately needed to call his name. If you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, for justice, for dignity against all odds, then leave a comment and subscribe. Because sometimes, purpose doesn't just find you on the walk home. It finds you when you choose to walk a different path,